Good afternoon, one and all. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me both pride and pleasure to welcome you to the concluding session of the three-day web e-conference organized by the English Department, Munger University, on recent trends in contemporary literature. We are already in some traumatic times with this COVID-19, which has almost taken the entire globe its effect. And for this session, we have a speaker who is a renowned professor and who will be talking to us. His topic is function of trauma in literature, a psychosemiotic perspective. For this keynote address, we have with us Professor Kumar Mishra. I'll just give you a brief introduction of Professor Mishra. Professor Kumar Mishra currently heads the PG Department of English at Tilka Manjhi, Bhagalpur University, Bhagalpur. He has a teaching experience of over 3 decades, of almost around 38 years, and he specializes in applied linguistics and contemporary criticism. He has supervised 7 PhD theses and has written several papers, and his publications have found place in several referred journals. Dr. Mishra is a well-known name in contemporary seminars and conferences. What adds variety to his expertise and to his knowledge is the fact that he has taught for 10 years in universities of the Republic of Yemen, the Sultanate of Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Libya. So that brings quite a good amount of experience, exposure, and variety to the expository of knowledge that he has. Today in this session, Professor Mishra will be delivering his talk on the function of trauma in literature with its psychosemiotic perspective. I would now like to request Professor Mishra to uh, deliver his talk. Sir, this virtual platform is all yours now, and we are eagerly waiting to listen to you. Professor Kumar Mishra. We in the meantime, I would also like to intimate the people who are following our live session that today itself we will have the valedictory function of this conference as we move towards the end of this 3-day e-conference, which is a mega success. If we take into account the viewership and the interest people from academics and from the field of knowledge have taken interest in various lectures delivered, be it by Professor Nivir Kumar Ghosh or by Professor Sanjukta Das Gupta or Professor H. Kalpana. Even today's first session was a very successful one, as it was reflected in the question raised by people who were viewing and listening that lecture. We look forward to have such organizations in future as well under the aegis of University of Munger, under the patronage of our revered Vice Chancellor, Professor Ranjit Kumar Verma, and Pro VC Professor Kushum Kumari. I would also like to make a mention of the efforts that the convener of this e-conference, Dr. B.C. Pandey, has taken, and I will acknowledge his interest and participation. Pandey sir, hello.
I think Professor Mishra has certain problems with internet connections, and we are waiting for him to rejoin. And in the meantime, I would like to announce that in the next session, we have with us our Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor Kusum Kumari, and to propose the vote of thanks, we will have with us Colonel Vijay Kumar Thakur, the Honorable Registrar of our university. And Professor Kusum Kumari has been not only a professor, she has been a kind of activist in women's studies, and she will be presenting her lecture today on the relationship between philosophy and literature, and she will also be talking about uh, what kind of new changes are taking place in the realm of women's studies. So that will again be a very fruitful session, and uh, I hope that the connection problem of Professor Udari Kumar Mishra is sorted out very soon, and he'll be back for us. We have with us. We are grateful to have Professor Kusum Kumari with us, and she will be chairing this session, validatory session that will be commencing shortly after this lecture ends. And we had by far all the sessions have gone uninterrupted, but unfortunately there is certain problem with the internet of Professor UK Mishra. He is trying to get back, and as soon as he gets back, we'll be uh, you know taking our ahead the proceedings of this conference. And I request the members of the technical team also to contact him on phone and
It
see.
is literature. It is vivid visual perception. It gives
We are extremely sorry for the inconvenience caused because of some technical issue with Professor UK Mishra. We are trying to sort it out. As soon as it is sorted out, we will be live again. In the meantime, I'd also like to make a mention that all our previous lectures of all the sessions are available on the YouTube channel of Munger University, and it can be accessed by anyone. If you feel that those lectures were fruitful of some academic use, you can definitely go to the YouTube channel of Munger University and have a look at them. Those of you who have joined late, it's a slight reminder that this session we had Professor UK Mishra, who is the head of the Department of Post-Graduation Department of English, TMB Bhagalpur University, for his lecture on the portrayal of trauma in literature, a psychosemiotic perspective. But because of some technical issue in the internet connection of Professor Mishra, we have uh, been disconnected from his network. Our technical team is in line to sort things out. As soon as we are connected, we will be live again, and we wish that we hear something fruitful and meaningful from Professor Mishra out of the stock of his expertise and knowledge on the topic. For those of you who are not from the state of Bihar, I'd like to tell you that the University of Munger is a fairly new one, established in March 2018. So it has been just a few months more than a couple of years from our establishment, and all these academics activities and pursuits are very new for us with this new setup, new infrastructural and technical advancements. But under the aegis, under the patronage of our respected Vice Chancellor, his administrative team at the university level, and the convener of this seminar, this e-conference, who also heads the Department of English at Munger University, Professor V.C. Pandey. This all has been possible, and we are barring today's session, we have been successful in having 5 sessions successfully completed with speakers from almost all parts of this country uh, participating and speaking on various topics related to the recent trends in contemporary literature. We are really sorry about the inconvenience caused. Please stay tuned. We will be back soon. We are trying to fix the problems that have been caused in the network of Professor Mishra. Okay, since we are having problem in establishing connection with Professor Uday Kumar Mishra, our team is looking into it. In the meantime, I would like to invite our respected Pro Vice Chancellor Ma'am, Professor Kusum Kumari, to address us, as a part of uh, some enlightenment and blessing that she draws as a result of her academic career and as a result of her career as an academician, as an institution builder. I'd request ma'am to please address us as we move forward towards the conclusion of this e-conference. Respected Pro VC, Professor Kusum Kumari ma'am.
Our Pro Vice Chancellor, Honorable Pro Vice Chancellor, has been requested to address the session since the speaker is not getting connected, and she will be joining us to connect herself. And as soon as she connects, she will be addressing us.
ले लो पानी.
Okay, ma'am is here. Before she starts, I'll have a small introduction of ma'am. Professor Kusum Kumari is an eminent scholar in the discipline of philosophy, a serious researcher, and a competent administrator known for her creative thinking and imaginative leadership. She has been credited with a lot of novel and new achievement, exercises and experiments in the field of in the Department of Philosophy during her tenure at the Munger University. She is an institution builder and an able administrator, and we are blessed to have her today among us. I'll request ma'am to kindly address us. Pro VC ma'am, it is kindly requested if you can please usher in some words for us.
A very good afternoon to one and all. Am I audible?
Ma'am.
आप मुझे सुन पा रहे हैं?
हाँ मैम सुन रहा हूँ. You are audible.
Okay. A very good afternoon to one and all. First of all, let me congratulate organizer, all the teachers of English Literature, Munger University, Munger, and the convener, Dr. Bhavesh Chand Pandey, for holding this e-conference on the topic Contemporary Trends in Literature. In the present situation of COVID-19 pandemic, webinar has become the mode of discourse and discussions. During 3 days of discourse and discussion, you must have updated yourself. Hence, my sincere thanks to learned speakers who shared their knowledge and thought with you. Though I am a teacher of philosophy, but I am not going to say that I have nothing to do with literature. Whereas literature is the mirror of society, philosophy is the vision, culture, civilization, part of religion, or the code of conduct of the society. But when we talk to But when we talk of the culture, civilization, or the vision of any society of any particular time, we have to go under the umbrella of literature, because language or the literature is the medium of expression. It is literature which give vivid visual perception descriptions of the society of that time. So literature and philosophy always move simultaneously. It is just two sides of same coin. Philosophy has always been in the root of literature, right from Plato and Aristotle to Sartre and Derrida. Philosophy has influenced literature and literary theory substantially. Aristotle laid down a standard of tragedy in literature. Kant's transcendental philosophy influenced the Romantic movement in 19th century. Nietzsche and Bergson were behind George Bernard Shaw's idea of Superman. Again, Marx influenced a great lot of literature, and Sartre was behind many modern literary texts, which is existentialist philosophy or the entire feminist philosophy or literature. Very recently, Derrida has said in the deconstruction thought based, Derrida's deconstruction thought based on his philosophical idea of meaning. So philosophy and literature has a long relation. Now let me come to the point. The journey of literature starts with growth of human civilization. No doubt, literature is the mirror of society. Upon the aspiration, struggles, sufferings, longings, happenings, and development of the people or the society in the particular period of time. The subject of this e-conference is the contemporary trends in literature. Modern literature is no more drawing room literature. It encompasses almost every aspect of our life. On the one hand, it portrays the struggle for survival in the decaying world, and on the other hand, it reflects how humans successfully emerged from the struggle without losing their humanity. The present webinar in the period of COVID-19 is one such example. World is now global village. So we are living in global village. Communication is very fast with a smartphone and cheap data accessibility, which is fast and free. Every day in writing and expressing oneself through blogging on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. New trends in literature are setting in. What trends today is obsolete tomorrow. Literature is vast and inclusive, so it adapts and adopts these new trends. The contemporary trends that stand out are the post-modern literature. For example, feminist literature, environmental literature, cyber literature, protest literature, children literature, diasporic literature, psychoanalytic literature, and most important, the Dalit literature. I have got Virangana Savitri Bai Phule Award for serious contribution in Dalit literature in 2007. Now, being a member of expert committee of UGC for developing women studies in all the universities of India, it is my duty to advocate women literature or feminist literature. So now I would like to come to the feminist literature. The modern women are no longer marginalized in the society. Instead, they think in terms of independence, physical, mental, psychological, and economical. The seek to do things that may establish their identity and keep it intact despite the traditional constraints they have suffering. They have successfully craved a niche for themselves. The women writers such as Nayan Tara Sahgal, Kiran Desai, Anita Desai, Jhumpa Lahiri, Arundhati Rai, Bharti Mukherjee, Shobha De, Mahasweta Devi, Rama Mehta, Manju Kapoor, Anamika Kishore, and many others have their own unique way of narration and style. Women as novelists, poets, filmmakers, critics have made their presence felt in the field of creativity. We have a host of women novelists who have proved themselves on the national and international forum. Arundhati Rai has conferred with the prestigious Booker Award for her novel The God of Small Things. Jhumpa Lahiri received the Pulitzer Prize. Shashi Deshpande and Kiran Desai have also made their mark. Margaret Atwood and Alice Walker have proved themselves on the international arena. These women writers have spoken against patriarchy, misogyny, hatred, hostile sexism. Women have struggled for equality since time immemorable. A new woman has emerged in 21st century. She has set a new trend, which has been depth within the film Thappad. If you have not seen the film, you may see. The lockdown during Corona will further set other new trends. Literature is the mirror of the society. It reflects what goes on, the sensitive mind of the artist feel it and pens it down. Thanking yours. Many, many thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk on the subject.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We are pleased to inform you that we have established connection with Professor UK Mishra, and we are now connected.
Okay.
In the meantime, I would like to thank Provisi ma'am for her pleasing and kind words, and we are delighted to know the depth she has showed in describing the condition of uh, Dalit writing as well as feministic writing in literature. I'd now like to invite Professor Uday Kumar Mishra, who is with us, and with a sense of sorry to the attendees and to the scholars present here that we lost connection. But now Sir is with us. I will hand over the platform to Sir. Sir, kindly please continue with your lecture on trauma in literature, a psychosemiotic perspective.
Well, I'm happy that I'm back for some reasons disconnected. And thank you, Tiwari. Thank you very much for that, connecting me again. Anyway, function of trauma in literature, a psychosemiotic perspective. Literature reflects what goes inside the world of experience. Human sufferings and pain, articulated through words in all forms of literature, make a case of trauma or suppressed pain or agony, which we do not see directly in any art form. Freud calls it suppressed pain or agony. To quote Maya Angelou, the famous African American poet and singer, human rights activist, she says, and the writer of very important autobiographical novel by her, talking about the agony of her rape at the age of 7.5, making her dumb for 5 years. The work is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I'm quoting Maya Angelou. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. The trauma is that untold story. And the reflection of trauma in the forms of literature is all there. Maybe since literature writings began. That's my presumption. Further, she says, in all forms of art, part of you is in the trauma, and part of you is a step away it. Now, the often quoted line by P.B. Shelley from To a Skylark. The famous line goes like, our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought. Here, saddest thought stands for trauma inside, and sweetest songs are great literary works as the manifestations of trauma. Now, my point here is to make a psychosemiotic study. A psychosemiotic study of the function of trauma in literature brings out many facets of the principle and the forms of trauma as the unclaimed experience. One of the famous trauma theory critic, Carrot, she says unclaimed experience. She calls it trauma as the unsolvable problem of the unconscious or the unspeakable voice. This involves linguistic indeterminacy, ambiguous referentiality, and aporia. Ambiguity in terms of referring in the form of language occurs wherever the trauma is reflected in words. The process of language, all forms of association with the outer world. This is what we call trauma as the unsolvable problem of the unconscious or the unspeakable voice, which involves linguistic indeterminacy or ambiguous referentiality. And symbolizations through language, giving meanings to the linguistic expressions of the unconscious, can be seen in the totality of the expression of trauma literature. Sometimes you might observe the character who suffered fails to express. The representations of trauma anchors the individual experience within a larger cultural context. And in fact, organizes the memory and meanings of trauma. Sometimes the trauma, the pain, is unspeakable by a character because of the social conditions of the social milieu. Maya Angelou herself could not speak because of the social and cultural conditions, and yet she suffered. I will discuss one of the very important quotes by Angelou's book later. When an experience of trauma of an individual is present in a larger cultural context, in its varied forms, in multiple situations, the trauma behind it is not traceable. Kathy Carrot observes. She says, trauma is not locatable in the simple, violent, or original event in an individual's past, but rather in the way that its very unassimilated nature, the way it is precisely not known in the first instance, returns to haunt the survivor later. However, the experiences in the form of memories of the past, search or inquiries into the self, or outburst of any kind are the reflections of some kind of trauma or pain deeply caused due to some violent or severe events in the past. This is what Maya says, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. This untold story haunts the survivor in most of the cases. Besides involving shock or disturbing events in one's personal life, trauma covers shocking historical events like German Holocaust, world wars, America's 9/11, communal violence, colonial aggression, and torture, etc. Many books, many texts, many novels have been written in the background of such events in the past. Experiences of rape, domestic violence, sexual abuse, economic deprivation, and natural calamities like famine, floods, tsunami-like events, pestilence or pandemics like COVID-19, and so many other situations where people encounter pain, shock, and remain under traumatic stress for long. Recently, I had a keynote address on literature and pandemics. I also talked about the fear and anxiety of the people during the pandemics, and literary works coming, expressing this trauma or the fear or the pain that we are under this pandemic or COVID-19. I myself have written a few poems. Anyway, that's a different story. As such, trauma is one form or other is present in all forms of literature depicting such events and experiences of life. The horror of German Holocaust in Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl, 1947, Elie Wiesel's Night, 1958, and the World War background in Virginia Woolf's Dolwell, Mrs. Dolwell, are all classic examples. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart tells us much about the colonial trauma, showing Europeans' invasions traumatizing the natives of the eastern part of Nigeria. Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things, all share the colonial trauma in a different manner. Don Lillo's Falling Man, written in the background of trauma produced through terrorism of 9/11. Kushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan tells us much about the trauma of partition, entering the mind with communal rights and fear. With all such things in the mind, writers writing about certain traumatic experiences of people in different stages of time. Psychology of trauma, a deconstructive approach. I would like to say how this trauma is expressed. Traumatic neurosis, according to Freud, guides the whole process of the sufferer's reactions in different forms. This is Freud. In one of his books, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, he talks about the repetition compulsion, in which people unwittingly repeat actions that hurt them and others. This interplay of pain and pleasure in life makes it a principle where it is posited with the reality principle. By reality principle, I mean when someone tries to come out of the trauma, goes for some kind of relief, and that relief is termed by Freud as the reality principle. There is a constant displacement of pain with pleasure in course of the human activity. Freud maintains, that any given process originates in an unpleasant state of tension, and thereupon determines for itself such a path that its ultimate issue coincides with a relaxation of this tension, relaxation of the tension. That is, with avoidance of pain or production of pleasure. This we can call displacement of pain with pleasure for relaxation. For him, this is termed as tendency towards stability. This is human nature, going for the stability. That's why this kind of relaxation. In this way, trauma causes a disruption and reorientation of the consciousness or the reality as experienced. This psychoanalytic approach goes well with Lacan's deconstructive approach when he says, this is very important what Lacan says, for what we have in the discovery of psychoanalysis is an encounter, an appointment to which we are always called with a real that eludes us. So the real is all elusive. This is a deconstructive approach, Derridian concept of the reality being elusive. On that line, Lacan has tried to analyze this idea of trauma. The elusive nature of the real is all because of the inability of language. This is to be understood. The elusive nature of the real is all because of the inability of language in locating the truth. The function of trauma in literature can be seen from this aspect or nature of language, which adopts alternative models or methodologies, suggesting the values that exist in the traumatic experience. In doing so, signs or symbols adopted in a literary work do not always signify the traumatic experience in true sense of the term. Trauma is not represented truly in terms of language or signs or references. This is something very crucial about the function of trauma. How does trauma function in literature? And that's why it is not represented truly. But trauma has a definite and determining role in the whole semiotic process, resulting in indeterminacy, ambiguity, or disjunction in a text. Trauma is there, guiding the whole expression, and yet trauma as such in true sense of the term is never seen. We call it aphoria or doubt is always there in the representation of the reality. This is purely deconstructive Derridian approach where the reality is never seen. People may question it, that Derrida did not go the right way in saying that, but that's a debatable thing. But as far as the trauma is concerned, there is some kind of similarity. So I have said the presence of trauma in the meaning of a text is like that of the presence of center in a text in Derridian sense. Derrida calls that the center, the central idea or the message is there in a text. and yet the center is absent. Because what we get out of a text is not the original meaning. This is Derrida. And perhaps this very deconstructive approach to trauma has been established by many critics of the time, of the present time. The center for Derrida is present in a text, but appears to be absent. That's why in Derrida's structure, sign, and play, he says, the center is not at the center. This is the famous line by Derrida. The center is not at the center. In the classical sense, the center is always at the center. But for Derrida, the center is not at the center. It is missing. It is elusive. And that's why it is said here. Similarly, the trauma in its original form is always missing in a text, but its presence is there to determine meanings in their different forms, in their ambiguous referentiality. To quote Carrot, for history, Carrot says, for history to be history of trauma means that it is referential, precisely to that extent that it is not fully perceived as it occurs. It is not fully perceived as it occurs. So something happened in the life, a traumatic experience, a very horrible event in the life. But the sufferer doesn't know what kind of fear or anxiety is there in the mind. So that's why she says, for history to be a history of trauma means that it is referential precisely to that extent that it is not fully perceived as it occurs. So trauma in a text has a referential value, not the whole repetition of the injury, as it is not fully perceived even at the time of the occurrence of the event. It's a very interesting area, rather debatable area to think over how trauma functions in literature, how does it work. This is one deconstructive approach I was talking about. I say, if psychological laws of human nature govern trauma, govern the function of trauma in literature, semiotic laws govern language and its meaning through signs and symbols representing the reality in the society as observed in the social settings. Hence, it is necessary to understand psychoanalytic as well as semiotic considerations for a comprehensive analysis of the function of trauma in literature. As such, neurobiological features of trauma refuse representation and cause dissociation due to profound suffering from an external source, which may be individual, perpetrator, or collective social practice. This is Ballaway, one of another critics, talking about trauma theory. Collective social practice, he refers to that. It is individual and at the same time a collective social practice. No doubt, Carrot observed, trauma is never simply one's own. Trauma is never individual. We are implicated, she says, we are implicated in each other's trauma. Suppose the trauma or the fear that grips the mind of the people in the recent COVID-19, or for that matter, 9/11 in America, for that matter, World War, for that matter, German Holocaust. It is not individual. It is collective. So trauma happens to be an expression of a collective trauma with shared historical origins. I maintain trauma is not always a personal injury. Trauma is not always a personal injury. It sometimes shares collective experience of pain with its historical origins passing through generations, in which the factors like ethnicity, race, racial trauma, ethnic trauma, gender-based trauma, the oppression of the female, that is what I mean by gender, and economic status, poverty, deprivation, play a determining role. In such cases, trauma is trans-historically carried by generations. It is the community at large which finds traumatized, and individuals become a part of the whole, sharing the same trauma. The trauma of the Dalits in India, the trauma of the minorities who suffer, they all shared the same trauma. The trauma the blacks suffer, the Negroes in America. This all speak of the collective trauma. Kirby Ferrer, one of the critics, a critic of the intergenerational trauma theory, states that traumatic experience is intergenerationally transmitted. And anyone and everyone experiences the same trauma by being the part of the community, racial groups, ethnic community, gender-based women folk, Dalits, economically deprived class, and even sometimes religious minority or groups, or the whole mass affected by pandemics, etc. This all creates a post-traumatic culture to which individuals or groups belong, sharing the same trauma. A large number of literary texts show that individual experiences of trauma are often carried over to collective trauma, especially in cases of historical trauma like slavery, which got transferred through generations. In case of African American community, even the term African American reminds us of racial horrors in the minds of the blacks in America. Maya Angelou's, I quoted earlier, autobiographical novel, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I know why the caged bird sings. She says at the beginning of the novel, if growing up is painful for the southern black girl, I repeat, if growing up is painful for the southern black girl, being aware of her displacement is the rust on the razor that threatens the throat. It is unnecessary insult. We know how Maya Angelou suffered this insult on being raped at the age of 7.5 and keeping mum rather, muteness was her only choice. The trauma of the community is shared as the collective trauma haunting an individual, in the words of Maya Angelou. Now I will talk about the post-colonial trauma, which includes all. Post-colonial trauma, the socio-political implications. The psychoanalytical theory of Jacques Lacan considers trauma as the unsolvable problem of the unconscious or the irreversible damage to the psyche. For Freud, it is a series of cyclical mortem symptoms due to the shock. Erikson finds it a stress or blow that may produce discarded feelings or behavior in an individual encountering traumatic experience. In literary texts, we find the reflections, manifestations of such a psychological condition in characters or situations depicted. This very approach, as prevalent in the present critical studies of trauma, may well be seen in the post-colonial context, covering the aspects like feminism, subalternism, and many other issues of the time and the thought. Critics such as Lockhurst, Mandel, Yeager, and Visser address the social and political implications of trauma within a variety of frameworks. Trauma in literature operates in various social and cultural contexts which determine the very nature and form of trauma itself. This is all psychological aspect of trauma, and yet I'm also talking about the collective trauma depicted in so many works of literature. In the classic model developed by Carruth on Freudian and Lacanian principles, trauma is seen as the ultimate, unrepresentable. This is Lacan. The return of the repressed. This is Freud. A sense of absence. That is all that we understand about it. But this cannot be the whole truth about the function of trauma in the post-colonial analysis of literature. Various forms of human behaviors and activities do form an association with political and cultural milieu which govern human behavior. Greg Foster finds that in Toni Morrison's Beloved and Arundhati Ray's The God is Small Things, the remembrance of the past does not produce a repetitive foreclosure of knowledge of trauma, but rather produces understanding and healing within a modern post-colonial reality. Trauma is not simply repetitive. Trauma is not simply the expression of the pain. Rather, in such works, the pain is there, and yet there is a desire to get rid of the pain. Accordingly, the psyche is positioned directly to historical factors that insist the condition of traumatic healing in a social amelioration of which the causes of past injuries cease to be operative in the present. This is first. The causes of the injuries cease to be present in the present scenario. Not if simply the repetition of trauma. Rather, I would say both Morrison and Ray show the traumatic experience of the past, and yet present a choice for betterment. This is something new that happened in the post-Freudian or Lacanian psychoanalysis of trauma. Both Morrison and Roy show the traumatic experience of the past and yet present a choice for betterment to come out of the suffering. I say the elements of dissent, anger, and dream, betterment, coincides with the elements of pain or trauma or suffering as reflected in many of the works of post-colonial literature. Similarly, the issues of women, the subaltern, Dalits, in post-colonial works surface with the traumatic experiences of the character, but there is an ample space for their amelioration or relief from the pain in changing the condition they live in. This very situation is very interesting about the present post-colonial literature. Trauma is not only the repetition of the repressed psyche. Trauma is not only the repetition of the repressed psyche, but also a force to bring a change in the existing human condition. I would like to conclude the lecture with a reference to two powerful works expressing trauma with a sense of amelioration, of freedom from the pain as experienced by the authors themselves. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, Michelangelo's, is one work that shows how someone, a caged bird, sings in freedom. This freedom, desire for freedom, is there along with the traumatic experience as expressed. I mentioned two authors, Harriet Jacobs' memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, share the same trauma of the authors who were raped but were bold enough to survive the trauma and get liberated. Bold enough to survive the trauma and get liberated. Silence in both Harriet and Maya, silence in both serves as the weapon to fight against the insult. Both of them use the silence. Maya Angelou remained mute for 5 years after the incident. In the court also, she kept silence when she was asked whether she was raped by Mr. Freeman. She says, I quote Maya Angelou, I despise the man. This hatred in Maya Angelou is very strong. I despise the man for making me lie. I used silence as a retreat. Harriet Jacobs narrates her tale of woes. I quote, he came every day, and I was subject to such insults as no person can describe. I would not describe them. If I could, they were too low and then too revolting. Too low, the incident of rape and and all that happened with her, but she mentions it too low, too revolting. Harriet's silence is a revolt, and Maya is equally in a mood of anger and hatred against the man who tortured her. She says, I didn't want to lie, but the lawyer wouldn't let me think, so I used silence as a retreat. Now I end up the two quotations with the same author, which express trauma at the same time, making something, a sense of revolt, though silent, and yet volcanic. The first quotation from the Harriet. She says, my lips move to make a confession. My lips move to make a confession, but the words stuck in my throat. This is the helplessness of the girl, not coming out with the words describing such a bad, horrible experience of life. My lips moved to make a confession, but the words stuck in my throat. I sat down in the shade of a tree at her door and began to sew. She became busy sewing. What is this? Similarly, Maya says almost very similar line. The lie, as she was asked to speak lie, the lie lumped in my throat and I could not get air. When she was asked to tell the lie, I couldn't get air. How I despise the man for making me lie. In all the dialogues, it is quite visible that trauma is not always in the same form as one perceives it. It is the characters or the situations or the social settings which mold the very nature of trauma, and at the same time, a kind of relief coming out of that. That relief may be in the form of anger, that relief may be in the form of silence, that relief may be in the form of revolt, but it is there. So trauma is not that something which was considered to be unspeakable, not completely saying the truth. That is something deconstructive approach. But in the post-colonial literature, we have references where trauma is not simply referring to the past incident, rather making it a point for a change in the present scenario, the present condition, and how the social and political conditions shape the mind of the characters. And this is how trauma is reflected. This is how trauma functions in literature, with the various aspects taken into consideration. We can find that trauma as present in literature is reflected in various forms, and it is not always rather what you call negative, not other pessimistic, rather it is along with the optimism behind all traumatic experiences in terms of expression. I'm not saying trauma is something good. Trauma is all disturbing, but at the same time, its expression in the socio-cultural and political condition is all with different angles taken into consideration. We can consider how trauma functions in literature from various angles. And the function of trauma has to be seen not from one approach, but from multiple angles to look at the function of trauma in literature. Maybe a further discussion might be done on the function of trauma in literature later. And I hope this is all what I have to say about the function of trauma in literature. And if people have any queries and questions, which I think most probably I would be there to answer the questions if you have any, because it's a highly debatable and highly sometimes controversial discussion could be there on the issue of the function of trauma in literature. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for such an enlightening and engrossing talk. We'll be taking up a few questions, if you permit. We have a few questions we'll be taking up shortly. So the first question is by Alia Mirza. If every reality is elusive and textual, then what about the scientific facts? Are they too elusive, real?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Alia Mirza. Thank you for this question. Really, it's all deconstructive approach, the Derridian approach that we talk about when we say reality is elusive. Now, in the postmodern condition, in the postmodern era, the post-structuralism or postmodernism, what we talk about, they all talk about reality not as the final. The reality is not the authoritarian approach to reality, that the reality is one, has been dismissed in the present scenario. That's why it's elusive. It's a rather what you call relativity in the theory, because everything is relative. What you call real is not real at all. And that's why that makes a search for the reality going on. That's why it's called elusive. Even the scientific facts, what Einstein talked about, the relativity theory, what you call real today, maybe next time it may not be real. Even in science, the reality also is changing. I'm not talking about the universal facts or something. There could be some universality in the facts, but as such, the search for the reality. So that's why it's elusive. Okay, I hope it's all for this question. Next.
Sir, the next question is by M.U. Murugan. Sir, where we could write definition all the traumas like collective, historical, Dalit, colonial trauma.
The right definition of traumas, trauma is such a psychological, what you call the psyche damaged or injured. But the reasons, or what we call collective trauma, when trauma is represented in the form of community, like the trauma of the blacks, it's a collective trauma. We share each other. This is what we call it. Historical. The trauma of the black coming historically, passing through generations, like Dalit. Dalits like in our India. The trauma of the Dalits is not the trauma of an individual. It's a group. It is the consciousness of the group, represented either in individuals' experience or in the experiences of others. So that's why it's, in a way, it is collective. I mentioned about this COVID-19 creating a kind of fear in the mind of the people, uncertainty. This is a great trauma that we are passing through. Can we call it individual? It's a group, it's a community. Rather, it's a pan-international phenomenon inflicting the mind of the people. Yes, how do you interpret the sense of belatedness in psychosemiotic narrative that operates in trauma literature? What sort of immediate or related narrative works in a victim's traumatized psyche? Yes, trauma, it is a repetition syndrome, as Freud calls it. It is repeated. It is belated, yes, of course. It comes later to haunt the mind of the sufferer. And yet, there is a kind of expression in the form, what you call semiotic narrative, expressed in terms of symbols and signs. That is what I talked about, that the man who suffered, the man who was injured, the injury or the cause of trauma may not be repeated in the same manner. It comes later, related. And so, in the semiotic narrative, in true sense of the term, trauma is represented in various forms. And this is what in my lecture I try to make it out, that trauma is not truly perceived even at the time of the occurrence of the injury. And so is the representation in other forms. That's, I hope it satisfies you.
So the next question is from Vishaka Devi. Sir, does not trauma vary from person to person? Should only sexual violence like rape be considered severe? Have texts related to trauma truly brought about a psychosocial change?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is not simply sexual violence, the violence of all kinds, even the domestic violence, even the child abuse, even social discrimination, even I what you call made out a very extensive list how German Holocaust, World War, it is all traumatic experience represented in various texts of the time. Even 9/11 in America, terrorism, that also caused that trauma. So trauma has a wide representation in different forms. It is not simply sexual violence or rape. I quote it because rape being the worst kind of trauma passed by the victims. And so I mentioned about Maya Angelou and Harriet, their biographies, telling much of the ugly aspects of human life and traumatized psyche of these two authors. But there are various texts where you can find them. Even Train to Pakistan by Kushwant Singh. Read that. The trauma of partition is there. Okay, thank you.
Sir, this is the last question probably, sir. This is from Tushar Bhanekar. How would you draw a fine line between individual trauma and collective trauma in case of LGBTQ community? How could one find a way out of it, especially in a patriarchal society like India?
Yeah, very interesting question. Yeah, this is what rather makes me happy to answer this question. So individual trauma and collective trauma. And this is almost all the critics of trauma theory. They have talked about both individual trauma and collective trauma. But in case of this LGTB, this community, their trauma can be considered as collective trauma, because there is no watertight line between the division between the individual trauma and collective trauma. Sometimes what is individual trauma is shared by others. This is what Maya Angelou also says. This is shared by others. It is not just individual. So there is no, that very distinction between the two. Sometimes an individual's experience can be an experience of the whole community. Many of the works talking about LGBTQ community, their suffering, their isolation, their social, kind of considering them something untouchable, like in our Indian society, something like that. That is there. So individual trauma often gets very much mixed up with the collective trauma. What is your individual feeling might be the feeling of the whole community or the society at large. So there is no distinction as such.
Thank you very much, sir. We are finished with the question and answers now. I would thank you for such an engrossing session, and in the meantime, I also say a bit of I'll seek sorry for the inconvenience that was caused because of some technical snag in our internet connection. But it was really nice. It was soothing for the ears to. Though trauma is not something listening about which it will be soothing, but at least listening about the various facets of it, especially the quotation that you quoted from Maya Angelou, that there is no, trauma, no agony more painful than bearing an untold story within.
Untold story,
and,
yes. Yeah.
And we wish that literature and people associated with literature like you will provide the medium for many such stories, such tales to come out. And we are thankful and pleased to have you here for this almost a treat of a talk. I had that opportunity to listen to you earlier also, but this platform definitely had benefited a lot of us, a lot of our students and our counterparts from the teaching fraternity. We are privileged to have with us now the respected registrar of Munger University. I'll request him, I'll call up him to deliver the vote of thanks. But before that, I'll like to make a mention that Colonel Vijay Kumar Thakur has had an experience, has served the Indian Army as a commissioned officer for more than 25 years, a participant of both the Operation Kargil and Parakram. Colonel Thakur is an alumnus of the Indian Military Academy, and we are privileged to have him as our registrar purely because of his academic and institutional pursuits. He is now serving as the registrar of Munger University. We are pleased to have him. Colonel Thakur sir, now I am requesting you to please propose the vote of thanks on behalf of the Munger University.
Thank you, Priranjan. Thank you, Priranjan. I hope I am audible to you all.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are audible.
Thank you. At the very outset, I want to express my gratitude and thanks to Department of English, Munger University, for organizing this national level e-conference on contemporary trends in literature. I am a student of science and literature. So far my knowledge goes, in simple words, it's a body of written works. And how you write something new. That is, it is by reading, understanding, comprehending, imagining, researching, and then putting all these thoughts together on a piece of paper. And the contemporary change in literature changes rapidly with lapse of time. Inventions, wars, invasions, policies, pandemics, everything causes a change in literary trend. For example, few latest edition of words in English are like blogs, artificial intelligence, predictive algorithm, etc. These are new trend in English literature, which is finding its place in literature, English literature particularly. During the span of last 3 days and 6 different sessions, we have the opportunity of listening to Honorable Vice Chancellor Munger University. In his welcome address, keynote speech by Professor N.K. Ghosh, followed by constellation of speakers on different timings, meticulously planned and successfully executed under the guidance of Dr. B.C. Pandey of Munger University. On behalf of Munger University, I thank all speakers from core of my heart and express my gratitude to the organizing team under Dr. B.C. Pandey for conceiving, convening, planning and organizing this e-conference on contemporary trend in literature for 3 consecutive days and bringing the constellation of literary wonders in India on same e-platform. On behalf of Munger University, I would like to thank again Professor Ranjit Kumar Verma, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor N.K. Ghosh for his brilliant coverage on anxiety of influences on the groups of academic ruminations on contemporary trend in literature. Professor Sanjukta Das Gupta of University of Kolkata, Professor I.D. Tiwari of IK Vishwavidyalaya Khargone, Professor H. Kalpana of Pondicherry University, Professor Madhumita Pati of Ramadevi Women's University, Bhubaneswar, Dr. Jacob of Delhi University, Professor Niladri Ranjan Chatterjee of University of Kalyani, Professor U.K. Mishra, Department of English, Tilkamaji Bhagalpur University, whom we heard just now. A special thanks to Dr. B.C. Pandey and his team of organizers, which were inclusive of Mrs. Rimpi Sarkar as moderator, Dr. Ananya Sundar Pali, Mohammad Safi, Danish, Dr. Antanu Paul, and Professor Priya Ranjan Tiwari. They all put their heart and mind together for bringing the literary wonders of English on one e-platform for the benefit of literary world across the country. I thank Professor Dr. Kusum Kumari for her delivering her valedictory speech. And at last, thank you once again to all of you, to all the literary worlds of our country who must have got benefited by hard work and sincere effort by Department of English, Munger University. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. That was really so kind of you to thank all of us. I'll once again, this is like just a reminder for those who were with us during these sessions. If you wish to go through the lectures of all the 6 sessions of this e-conference, you can please log into the YouTube channel as well as the official Facebook page of Munger University. And regarding your queries and your feedbacks, you can please write it to us, or you can please post messages on our official Facebook page. We wish to come forward to you with some more literary treats like this. And for the time being, we are signing out as we conclude this 3-day e-conference from Department of English, Munger University. Finally, thanking the technical team, especially, I'd like to mention of Abhishek, make the mention of Abhishek, who made this all technically possible by joining and making it look so smooth for creating a platform, technical virtual platform, where we could invite speakers and guests from various parts of the country. By thanking everyone, I am now signing out as we conclude this e-conference. Thank you very much. Hope to see you soon. Please stay safe, stay happy, stay home. Thank you. I'd request Dr. B.C. Pandey sir to officially announce the closure of the e-conference. Pandey sir is also the convener of this e-conference, so I'll request him to please announce the official closure. Pandey sir, please.
Thank you, Priya Ranjan. Before I call it a day, generally after the vote of thanks, it is the moment to call it a day. But I can hardly stop my temptation from bringing on screen some of my the organizing team, because without their help, it could not have been possible. First of all, as a convener, I feel duty bound to thank our Vice Chancellor and Pro Vice Chancellor and Registrar, who and also the distinguished speakers who made this program such a beautiful treat for us. And I'd also like to remember on this platform the senior most teacher of this University of Dr. Mahesh Prasad Singh, and particularly I would like to mention one person who had been a part of our university, but today he is working outside. He's none other than Soumya Mohan Ghosh. I would like to remember him because he made a very fruitful contribution to the success of this web conference. I have no words to describe the sincerity and diligence with which India has conducted the entire thing. He has taken too much of pains for making this program a success, and I would say that he was the de facto convener, and he just put the crown on my head. So I thank him for that, and I think I thank Dr. Tausif, Priya Ranjan, Rimpi, Tabarak, Atanu, Safe, Dr. Abhimanyu, Ajay Kumar, and all the other persons who have come to help us. And in particular, I would also like to mention the name of Abhishek for for working day and night for making this program a grand success. In the end, it was the success of a team, and I am grateful to have such a wonderful team with me. And today, when we were struggling in the first session, also MP came forward for helping us, and somehow the last moment, our pro vice chancellor came for our rescue. So overall, it was a wonderful experience for all of us. Before calling it a day, I would request the admin to have a snap of this screen. And if those who have been left can be brought in another frame, and that snap can also be taken. So with this, I end up the proceedings of the web conference. Thank you all.